Tyne asks whether do you have perhaps any suggestions concerning overlap with regard to the publication dates between search updates? We usually maintain an overlap of 3 months with the previous search date, but for a living systematic review, this would mean that we would be screening as many or more old, already screened hits than new hits each time.
Sure. So is this, from this part of that question, so it was about like if you're, rerunning searches all the time, that you're bringing up records that have already come up in previous searches that may have been either excluded or they've been included in your review? Is that?
I think it's also, Beck, about searching before your previous search to ensure that anything that's been added to the database subsequently is incorporated. I'm wondering whether I can see Steve McDonald is online, whether he might have a view on this as well, if you don't have any immediate thoughts.
Yes, Steve is definitely much more qualified in his amazing expertise in the searching department. If you were keen to comment, Steve.
I think this is exactly why, team, we would emphasise the core role of having an information specialist as part of the team. These kinds of questions and managing the multiple search results from multiple databases with different timestamps and so on, crucial to have an information specialist involved. I don't know the answer to your question, but Steve may jump into the chat with a response.
I guess maybe the comment I would make is, that process of deduplication every single time we do our searches will, to some degree identify that. Obviously, there's still a lag between what's actually uploaded across various databases, but I think some of that deduplication process and having that, overarching library of all records identified to date addresses it somewhat, but maybe not the nuance.
Steve's just messaging me. He says he'll put a response in the chat because we can't hear him and his microphone's not active, but he will put a response in the chat. Thanks very much, Steve.
While waiting for his response, Serena asks whether there are any effective AI tools for living systematic reviews at the time.
Absolutely. And so the Screen for Me platform is the most effective and I would say recommended AI informed tool to use, which we've used within our living systematic reviews for some time. So it encompasses the RCT classifier, so deciding whether whether studies are randomized controlled trials or not. So I think that's probably the most effective and most widely used to date. There are some tools that have been developed for other stages of a systematic or other steps of a systematic review. So there's some tools or semi-automated tools that have been used for automation of things like risk of bias. But there's very few that are fully automated for use across any of the steps.
The advent of AI is rapidly transforming the way we do systematic reviews. Is the same likely to be true for living systematic reviews? I don't know how you feel, Beck, but I think absolutely. I suspect that in 3 to 5 years' time, AI is going to have totally changed the way we do, especially the sort of the front end part of the review, the screening and inclusion, data extraction, and probably moving into RAB as well. It seems like lots of those tools you were mentioning, that there is a plethora, an explosion of new tools, lots of which aren't tested or evaluated well now. But I suspect that over the next couple of years, we're going to move away from human-led screening for those early parts and towards AI-led processes. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's definitely my sense. And I should also flag, there's a great presentation from James Thomas that's within the Cochrane website somewhere that's about, the current AI tools and where things are up to. But, in chatting with him most recently, obviously the changes that are happening at the moment are rapid. And I agree, Tari, that we will get to a point that a lot of these steps will be predominantly AI driven. And it may be that, some of the steps actually are combined to some degree where, AI or AI-driven platform can combine some of our steps to, drastically reduce the author contribution that's required.
Yeah, completely agree. It does feel like in 3 years' time we'll be looking back and feeling like we were so old school in 2025.
Yeah.
There's another comment in the chat from Kavita saying, if I may perhaps take a look at your deduplication method software to improve remaining duplicate rates. I think that's another question, Kavita, where it'd be great to talk from information specialists. So there are lots of different approaches to this, including Confidence and other tools which have deduplication built in, and really important to get the methods right for this, because you so do not want to be rescreening stuff you've previously excluded or any of those things. Getting this part right is crucial workflow. Any thought from you, Rebecca?
No, I would emphasize everything you said. Enough, like within our own team, we often end up using a combination of those tools where we know that Confidence is good at identifying one particular type of duplicate and others for others. So I think, I totally agree. Teaming up with the information specialist and understanding exactly what the right method to use is a good idea.
Great. I've just got a message from Steve. I'm going to just post it into the chat for everybody. I think we can. So I hope that answers your question, team. There's also a question here from Katie Webster. Do you know of any examples where updated LSR results have immediately impacted healthcare policy or practice? I wonder if there is still a long lag before any findings are implemented due to the timescale that policymakers work with. I'll give you a thinking time. I think our experience during the COVID pandemic was that LSRs in COVID were almost immediately translated into policy context, and COVID was a very particular and unique situation. But in that context, people were asking us on a weekly basis if we'd updated the LSRs underpinning our living guidelines. And I think as Sam Chakraborty is leading a whole kind of portfolio of work around living evidence for policy, and there are different issues there, but it's a really important area. There's a couple of, did you have any thoughts, Rebecca, about examples where of sort of immediate impact of translation of LSRs?
Yeah, I don't have any immediate examples. I think one of the benefits of the original Living Systematic Review we undertook was I work within a health service organisation implementing community setting programs. And so some of the original results that we were getting from our Living Systematic Review, we were looking to implement in practice. So maybe not a direct connection to policy or guidelines in any of the work that I've led, but we've certainly adopted some of it within our local practice, within our local health service.
Yeah, I think too, it's probably worth noting in the policy context that one of the major barriers to policy use of evidence that's been identified for decades is the lack of availability of an up-to-date review when the policymaker wants it. That kind of timeliness question has been a major barrier for evidence to inform policy, and certainly living reviews overcome that barrier. There's another question, Rebecca, from Elena de Carvalho Gomez, saying, also for non-RCTs, ? In my area of work, infectious diseases preparedness, prevention and control, we work mostly with non-RCTs, identifying relevant epidemiological studies to answer questions regarding incubation periods, risk factors, risk group, etc., is still very challenging for both humans and machines. Any reflections on non-RCT evidence?
I think, obviously a living approach can be adopted, for any type of study. So I think that's a big yes if you want to use it for non-RCTs. I think there's other things that you need to consider though, other considerations. So often, especially like with the tools that are available at the moment, a lot of those automation tools are set up for the identification of randomised controlled trials. So there may be the circumstance where you have less automation tools available at your fingertips to reduce the resources that are available, but there's no reason why the methodology can't be adopted or used for non-randomised control trials.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing, Rebecca and Helena. We're also applying these kinds of methods to preclinical evidence, so evidence from animal models and in vitro studies. And you're absolutely right. Very additional challenges around identifying those studies and screening them is much more complicated. Data extraction. I could talk sometime about the complexity. You're right, it's much more challenging, but the same methods apply, and the same process of continual evidence surveillance and repetition of all those core LSR, core systematic review tasks still applies. But can I ask you a question, because there's another question in the chat? What has been your experience, the most challenging thing about doing living systematic reviews? Because you've got a fair bit of experience under your belt now.
That's a good question, Tari. I think sometimes it's maintaining the momentum. So I think we've, I guess, over the years experienced some challenges with, who's actually conducting our searches for us. So we have gone from, approaches where we've had an information specialist running all of our searches, and then we've taken it within our team. So I think sometimes, maintaining that capacity, like for such a long period of time, can actually be challenging. And I think especially in the context of, funding, which is often tied to grants or limited or time limited pieces of funding. So I think, it's that maintenance, the sustaining motivation, and sustaining the team over time to keep continuing would probably be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, keeping on.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a question now from Narelle Willis, Rebecca, with the change to the Cochrane Central Editorial Service rather than Cochrane Review Group-based editorial services, do you need to flag with the Central Editorial Service that you'll be updating the Living Systematic Review? The timeframes can be much longer with CES than they were with CRGs, and if you're planning on updating every 1 or 3 months, this could be a problem. I know you've got some experience around this, Beck. I don't know if you've got any thoughts. I'm happy to jump in with our reflections on the COVID review experience too.
Yeah, for sure. I think the new model for our editorial services has been, I think, challenging in terms of what has been previously able to be published quite quickly. So within the filer, we were able to publish 2 reviews within, actually 3 reviews in the end, within 4 months each, and that was massive. Like, it required really large changes to the editorial and peer review kind of workflow. I think since then it has been a little bit more challenging, and like the timelines are a little bit longer. So I probably don't have anything more to comment on from that, but just to acknowledge that has been, that has actually also been challenging recently.
Yeah, and I'd echo that too. I think there's been a transition period with the Cochrane Central Editorial Service, and obviously that team's now significantly bigger than it was and in place, and we're having lots of conversations with them about how we can expedite the process of publishing LSRs. But yes, to answer your question, Narelle, absolutely, you need to flag with the Central Editorial Service, that you're planning on doing a living systematic review, but then at every update stage. And there are things in the process that can be streamlined around how peer review is handled and those sorts of things. So yes, definitely get in contact with the editorial team.
I guess the other thing I'd probably add to that as well, something that's happened with our living systematic review over time, is that we have refined our eligibility criteria for some of our updates, where we've found, particular areas where we had strong evidence or where we wanted to, maybe ask a more specific review question to identify a defect of a particular intervention type. And same thing, we said we went to Central to say we want to update the review, but we also want to change this criteria, and getting feedback on any of those amendments to your methodology, and obviously the endorsement to publish a new update before you actually embark on it.
Yeah, I'd agree. And my follow-up question to you, Rebecca, was going to be, what's the most kind of the best part of doing an LSR for you? And I think part of that is actually that dynamism for us in the review. You can take in feedback from end users, from researchers, from contributors, and reshape the review over time to be more useful. And there's another question from Kiddist in the chat, which says, how do you address issues related to resource intensity? I imagine that's about in terms of managing the team workload and so on. Rebecca, any thoughts?
I think I have been particularly fortunate to have a group of early career researchers like myself that have lots of capacity. So we've always had lots of hands willing to jump in and help when required. So we've certainly had resource intensive periods where we needed to pull all the team in together to undertake data extraction, grade, risk of bias, etc. when we're doing a review update. But in between times, it's actually a very, very small number of people. So myself and one other co-author that's involved in kind of the ongoing maintenance of the living systematic review between updates. But yeah, I think it's a pre-planned approach where we know approximately when we think something's going to happen, and having all of those authors and those other resources ready to go at that point, and reflecting on that every 12 months for a 12-month period at a time, so that people know what may or may not come, and we know who could be available or not available, or where we need to go out to other authors to get more resource in.
Yeah, and I think that links to your point about the importance of the planning and the kind of workflow management elements of the living systematic review process. I think as you flag, the core methods are very similar to a standard review, but that workflow management is actually the difference between an LSR that works and an LSR that doesn't. So being able to predict, as you say, in advance, we're going to need people in April and May to do screening, or whatever the kind of timeframes are, I think can be really helpful. There aren't any other questions in the chat, Rebecca, so I gave you a heads up. What do you think has been the most rewarding part of doing living systematic review approaches?
Oh, I feel like I'm going to cheat a little bit. I think having the opportunity right from the outset to be able to test this as a concept, and to be able to pilot some of those original, automation tools as they were developed and new workflows, absolutely has been a highlight for me. I think, obviously, like being able to maintain it over time and to see the number of studies grow in particular types of interventions, and to see the evidence change over time as well to some degree. So where we would actually provide our recommendations for, what you should be doing about fruit and vegetable consumptions in young children. So I think that, just the changing evidence and being able to kind of have it at your fingertips and know exactly what it is, all the way through that process since 2018 has probably been the most exciting bit. But yeah, I think the original testing and being involved was also like a massive highlight for me.
I feel the same way, and having seen the uptake of living approaches and then their use, particularly in the pandemic period, but now beyond that, it's really exciting. Narelle's asking a very practical question about how you search for a living systematic review on the Cochrane Library. I think essentially there's no standard way, Narelle. We literally search for living review or living. There may be others on the call from Cochrane who've got a better way than we do for doing that, but I don't have any clever ways. Rebecca, do you have any tips for how to identify living systematic reviews?
No. And I think, within Cochrane, obviously the title of the review doesn't indicate that it's a living systematic review. It's only once you see the abstract or the full paper itself that you know. So no, I use the same approach, Tara.
It's a good question though, and helpful prompt, Narelle, for us to go back to Cochrane and suggest that they make these easier to identify.